Hi, my name is Larry Walters, and this video is part of the Leveraging Land-Based Finance for Local Governments prepared by the Global Land Tool Network and UN Habitat. In this video, we'll be talking about leasing and selling publicly owned land. So we'll cover both those topics. We'll also present a couple of cases, and then you'll be able to discuss these cases in both your small groups and in your large groups. The objectives in this session are pretty straightforward. We want to first recognize that leasing public lands is an important source of funding in some parts of the world. We also want to be able to articulate the key tasks that must be performed in order to effectively administer a system for leasing public lands. We also want to recognize that leasing public land does not preclude applying other land-based finance instruments to the same land. Key concept here: leasing publicly owned land through multi-year leasing agreements for either an annual or one-time revenue or both creates a private leasehold interest that allows private entities to develop that land and potentially sell the lease in a secondary market. So let's get some definitions down. First, what do we mean by selling public land? Well, this is pretty straightforward. It's the payments that are received in exchange for freehold title to public lands. It's monies that are collected once and they're paid by the purchaser of the land. With regard to premiums, there are really two concepts in play. The first is what we call a lease premium. This is a payment also received in exchange, but for the right to occupy and benefit from that public land for a specific period of time. It's assessed once and collected once. It's paid by the purchaser of the leasehold. The second concept is the recurring lease payment. These are also payments that are received in exchange for the right to occupy and benefit from the land for a specific period of time. The difference is that these payments occur periodically and they recur over time, and they can be adjusted based upon changing conditions. They're also paid by the purchaser of the land. The purpose of these instruments is primarily to generate revenue for public projects, but it's also to contribute that land to the market for real estate development. An additional goal may be to engage the private sector to develop and use the land in a way that is socially beneficial or in accordance with broader public plans and visions. What are the minimum requirements? For leasing land, it's actually a fairly complicated system. You first of all need to have an appropriate enabling legal framework. Then there needs to be the administrative and the planning capacity to determine which lands are available for lease. Not all public land will be available for lease. Some of it you'll want to hold as a reserve for other public purposes. Identifying which land should be made available for lease requires administrative and planning capacity. You also need an appropriate estimate of the market value of the land that's to be leased. All too often, leased public land is undervalued, and the full economic benefit is not received by the government from that land. You also need the administrative ability to solicit and negotiate leases. Some of the negotiating skills may or may not be readily available to you. You'll need to develop those if they're not. You need the administrative ability to monitor leases for the duration of the lease. These leases last for a long time. 50 to 100 years is not uncommon. Throughout the duration of the lease, those leases need to be monitored to make sure that the terms and conditions of the lease are being satisfied. It may be that the lease payments need to be revisited from time to time. It may be that there's a change in land use, which may require a new lease premium. There's a relatively sophisticated professional infrastructure needs to be in place within the government to monitor and manage these leases. And then you need the administrative capacity to allocate and manage the lease proceeds. How will the money be used for what public purposes? Selling public land may seem a bit more straightforward up front because there's only one-time payment that has to be managed. But you still need the appropriate enabling legal framework. You need the administrative and planning capacity to determine which land should be privately developed. You need the capacity to manage a transparent and fair sales process. This probably means an auction of some sort. And you need the capacity to allocate and manage the sale proceeds. When the proceeds Those large sums come in from the sale of land. Where does the money go? How does it get managed? How does it get allocated? That process needs to be carefully articulated as well. The difference between ground rent and land tax. While ground rent or lease payments are often recurring, it's important to recognize that they're not the same as a land tax. The lease payments compensate the landowner, the government, for occupying and using the land. Lease payments do not reflect the service burden placed on the local community. The cost of public usage for the infrastructure and the services is frequently not reflected in ground rents. Whatever the use the lessee makes of the land, that lessee is also making use of public infrastructure and public services. Land rents and leases are important sources of revenue, but they are not incompatible with paying a tax based upon the land. Those two, because you're buying different things. When you pay the lease payment, you're getting the right to occupy the land and use it beneficially. When you're paying a land tax, you're paying for the public services that land will receive, and those are different concepts. It's possible that if the rates are structured appropriately, they could be combined into a single payment. Rarely happens. By and large, the ground rents tend to be low, and even if the ground rents are set appropriately, it's not incompatible to also have a tax based upon land. There are also some important ideological differences in how land leasing systems are approached. The basic question is, who is the best steward of the land? Those who feel that private citizens acting in their own interest will yield the most efficient market outcomes will pursue a leasehold system that mirrors as closely as possible a freehold system. The leases will be for very long terms, and leaseholders will have substantial freedom in how they use the land. Those who see land as an important public asset and the government as the better long-term steward of the interests of the people will pursue a leasehold system with much shorter-term leases and will have much more public oversight. Key factors in land leasing. The first is the length and renewability of the lease. Longer-term leases with nearly automatic renewal closely mimic a freehold system. They're meant to incentivize private entities to develop the land. Longer leases are more common and attractive to private entities. Short-term leases, on the other hand, theoretically give the government more control and autonomy to develop the land as it sees fit in the long-term best interests of the community. There are also variations then in rent payment options. Typically, they're structured in two ways. Either there's an annual payment based on the value of the land with a 3 to 5% total land value being paid up front, or they're paid in one lump sum. It's also common for governments to require an upfront lease premium in addition to whatever annual lease payments there are. If the leaseholder seeks to change the land use during the lease period, an additional lease premium may be required. In any event, leases should be structured so that annual lease payments can be adjusted to reflect changing market conditions. Next factors are land valuation methods and ownership of the improvements. With regard to land value, either the government has a system for identifying and valuing that land, or it's determined by the market through an auction of some sort. Government assessments are probably the more common approach, but land auctions are also used as well. With regard to ownership, the big question is, I come in, I lease the land, I put all these investments in. At the end of the lease, who owns the improvements? Lessees are allowed to develop and improve the land by constructing or repairing buildings that are already there. When the lease expires, or it's collected by the government for some reason, the lessee is generally entitled, in most cases, to the full monetary value of any remaining value in the improvements. Whether the compensation is due and how improvements are valued varies across countries. Some systems allow the leasehold interest to be subleased or sold in the secondary market, and others are much more restrictive in that regard. Let's talk about the characteristics of an effective land lease system. To be effective, from a revenue generation perspective, the systems which are most closely resemble freehold systems are the most productive from a revenue perspective. Okay? What about affordable housing and government facilities? Leasehold systems are very useful in this regard because the government holds all the cards. They have the land. They can set whatever terms they wish for the lease, and they can provide land discounts for specific purposes. They can require certain kinds of activities to be done on the land, and putting in housing, and some of it may have to be affordable. Because they can structure the lease however they wish, these affordable housing and government facilities can be accommodated quite nicely in a leasehold system. Regulation of land use. Leasing has not proven to be terribly effective, even in countries where they have a strong infrastructure in place to monitor the system. It's proven to be expensive and therefore difficult to enforce land use regulation restrictions on leasehold properties. There's also really very little evidence to support the notion that leasing land is going to stimulate economic and industrial development. So what are the steps in implementing land lease policies? The first is the need for an inventory. You have to figure out which lands are available and to be leased and for what purposes. You also need to have specialized institutions to help manage those land assets. You need professionally managed institutions that are essential to capture the most land value and to adequately manage the system over time. Again, these leases tend to be very long-term, and you need to have the public infrastructure in place to manage that system, to make sure that the lease terms are being complied with, to update payments as necessary, to monitor conditions, to make sure that everything is working the way it needs to be effective. You also need then a plan for what you're going to do with the money, and I suggest that you consider earmarking the revenues for specific investment purposes. Finally, it's quite likely that the land is already being occupied and used by somebody, maybe formally, maybe informally. If you're going to lease the land for a long term, there needs to be some sort of compensation policy for those public land, for the people who occupy the land currently. It's important to establish a compensation policy for the current tenants and to ensure that such policies are uniform and consistent. Now let me say a word about public-private partnerships, because this is one area that is receiving a lot of attention around the world. Essentially, the notion is that a private entity will come in and lease land from the government for a revenue generation purpose. It may be an airport, it may be a toll road, it may be a seaport, it may be a sports arena. But the notion is that in exchange for a long-term lease, the company will provide an ongoing revenue stream for the government. Public-private partnerships of this sort entail a mutually beneficial relationship between the government and the private enterprise to achieve a specific purpose. If the facility already exists, entering into that lease generally involves a substantial cash payment up front to the government in addition to periodic lease payments. If the asset is to be developed, the private company provides the capital for any construction, and the private company will provide the capital for ongoing maintenance and expansion of the facility as well. In either case, the private partner operates and maintains the facility for the length of the lease, generally 50 to 99 years. Now this sounds like a great plan for government and for the public. It gets private investment capital rather than public funds used to invest and maintain. There's often a higher level of service than can be afforded by the local government. There are some cautions as well. Recognize that businesses see these ventures as income producing, and they will require an adequate return on their investment. That means that they'll want the ability to increase rates over time to assure that that income stream is adequate for their own return. So the government needs to be clear in the lease documents how often and how much these lease payments or these user charges can go up, whether it be for a toll road, an airport, whatever. that you also need to make sure that there are some minimum level of service that is required as specified in the contract. Businesses have an incentive to keep their costs down and their revenues up. That means that if the lease needs to specify what the minimum maintenance standards are, and again, there need to be provisions for having those assets come back to the government if the lease is not adequately followed through on. So what are the impacts of leasing? Revenue potential, it can be quite substantial if you have the appropriate and effective administration in place. Instances in which that administration has been weak, revenue generation has simply not met expectations. Incentives for private investment, the issue of incentives should be weighed carefully. Land speculators exist in the leasehold world just as they do in the freehold world. And it may be possible for someone to lease land just to tie it up for a period of years with the expectation that land values are going to go up and they'll be able to sell the lease to someone else down the road and make a handsome profit with a minimal investment up front. So the lease agreements probably need to be structured to require that the land is developed within a specified period of time, or the lease is automatically canceled. Social impacts, again, as I mentioned before, achieving desirable social impacts is quite feasible through leases. Spatial and planning implications. The spatial and planning implications for either sales or leases will depend heavily on how well integrated these instruments are with an effective planning process. So, summary. The government entity must have available land, and it must have the administrative capacity to administer and regulate a leasehold or land sale system. To develop a leasehold system from the ground up, you have to identify the public land that's appropriate for leasing, develop a specialized institution to manage that leasing process, earmark the revenues for some specified purpose, and develop a compensation plan for the people that are already using that land. Governments without a strong administrative ability to manage leasing systems have not found success in generating meaningful revenue from leases. The more control the government relinquishes in leasehold arrangements typically results in greater revenue levels. The most successful systems in terms of revenue are those that most closely resemble a freehold system. So we have two cases now. Case number 15 is called land leases in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has a long tradition of leasing. In Hong Kong, the government owns all of the land. When you wish to acquire property for development, there is a lease premium determined at auction. There's an annual lease payment that's paid. In addition to that, there is an annual land tax that is paid as well. And you can see the details of that in the Hong Kong case. Finland also has a long history with land leases. One of the interesting features about the Finland situation is that cities have the ability to choose whether they're going to be freehold or leasehold. And some cities have gone both directions. And so you have an interesting mix in Finland, and you'll see that in the case as well. So thank you very much. Enjoy your discussion.